Part 3, Abolition as Praxis. As we have seen then, according to Davis, Gilmore, and Ben Moshe, the espousal of the goal of prison abolition ultimately requires a commitment to radical, revolutionary transformation of social relations. The three pursue, nevertheless, somewhat different argumentative lines. Whereas Davis sketches a more synoptic account, including a longer durée depiction of the U.S.'s historical trajectory, with special emphasis on the legacy of slavery, Gilmore's focus is more presentist or conjunctural. She goes into more detail about the astronomical expansion of the prison system in relation to the organic crisis of the military Keynesian order and the ascent of neoliberalism. Ben Moshe, for her part, pays perhaps less attention to matters of history and causation. Instead, she traces a comparison with the movement to deinstitutionalize people labeled as mentally ill and makes use of this comparison to help map out strategies for decarceration and excarceration. Despite these different approaches, the three authors all agree not only on the ultimately revolutionary implications of the abolitionist agenda, they also agree on Gilmore's and Gorse's idea that the way to consummate such a revolution is through the tactical pursuit of non-reformist reforms. By contrast, Dylan Rodriguez, in his 2018 article on Abolition as Praxis of Human Being, flirts openly with the more insurgent mode of abolitionist theory and praxis. According to Rodriguez, abolition is best conceived as a dream toward futurity vested in insurgent counter-civilizational histories, genealogies of collective genius that perform liberation under conditions of duress. Like Davis, Rodriguez situates this dream as emerging from a long historical praxis, one grounded in a Black radical genealogy of revolt and transformative insurgency against racial chattel enslavement and the transatlantic trafficking of captive Africans. Fundamentally, for Rodriguez, abolitionism is constituted by militant resistance to carceral state violence in all of its manifestations, including but not limited to imprisonment, jailing, detention, and policing. At the same time, Rodriguez contends, like Davis and Ben Moshe, that abolition is not merely a practice of negation, a collective attempt to eliminate institutionalized dominance over targeted peoples and populations, but also a radically imaginative, generative, and socially productive communal and community building practice. Indeed, he insists, abolition seeks, as it performs, a radical reconfiguration of justice, subjectivity, and social formation that does not depend on the existence of either the carceral state, a statecraft that institutionalizes various forms of targeted human capture, or carceral power as such, a totality of state-sanctioned and extra-state relations of gendered, racial, colonial dominance. Palpably more so than Davis, Gilmore, or Ben Moshe, Rodriguez is of the opinion that the logic of abolitionism is in contradiction to the logic of reform. Rodriguez argues that the contemporary reformist approaches to addressing the apparent overreach and scandalous excesses of the carceral state, characterized by calls to end police brutality and mass incarceration, fail to recognize that the very logics of the overlapping criminal justice and policing regimes systemically perpetuate racial, sexual, gender, colonial, and class violence through carceral power. Indeed, what's worse, for Rodriguez, reformist approaches ultimately reinforce a violent system that is fundamentally asymmetrical in its production and organization of normalized misery, social surveillance, vulnerability to state terror, and incarceration. Rodriguez's account of abolitionism differs from Davis and Gilmore in his explicit distancing of his concept of revolutionary insurgency from reliance upon a Marxist theoretical underpinning. To this end, Rodriguez claims inspiration instead in, among other traditions, queer theory and the decolonial turn. He seeks to significantly complicate and productively disarticulate teleological or formulaic notions of classical Marxist social transformation while intervening in patriarchal and masculinist constructions of freedom, self-determination. At the same time, he would at least implicitly distance himself from the notion of non-reformist reform, even though he explicitly refers to the notion approvingly in passing in a footnote when he claims to aspire to obliterate liberal optimistic paradigms of incrementalist reformist social justice. For Rodriguez, abolition should be considered as a counter-civilizational distension of freedom that defies the modern disciplinary and generally militarized orders of the citizen, the nation state, jurisprudence, politicality, and most importantly, the gendered racial ascendancy of the white human and its deadly regimes of normalized physiological and cultural epistemic integrity. Like Davis, Rodriguez highlights the continuity between the contemporary carceral state and the legacy of slavery. Indeed, he stresses this continuity even more so than does Davis, or for that matter, Gilmore. This is because Rodriguez relies more closely on Afro-pessimist appropriations of the concept of racial capitalism that stress the fundamental continuity of the racial order in relation to its origins in the Middle Passage and on the plantations, not to mention settler colonial genocide, more than do Marxist and Gramscian accounts, such as those provided by Davis and Gilmore, with their theoretical focus on the dynamics not just of continuity and reproduction, but also, crucially, of historical change. According to Rodriguez, there has been a general historical continuity of power relations that structure U.S. state institutions and the social economic formations within which they perform their sovereignty. Which is not to say that Rodriguez disregards history. To the contrary, Rodriguez emphasizes the continuous legacy of historical origins. To this end, he argues that there is an ample and still growing archive of study that explicates the roots of the contemporary U.S. carceral regime in the paradigmatic national power relation of racial chattel. Indeed, Rodriguez contends that contemporary abolitionist praxis thus amplifies the notion that abolition is an unfinished project precisely because the slave relation has never been abolished and instead has been constantly reanimated through changing regimes of carceral domestic war. Rodriguez goes on to sketch the key historical moments through which this unfinished project has passed. In his words, as a relation of chattel colonial dominance, incarceration emerged with particular global force through 1, the historical technologies of captivity that structure the transatlantic Middle Passage and the hemispheric racial chattel enslavement of African descended peoples, and 2, the geographic ecological production of the Western civilizational project via the Treaty of Tordesillas, Manifest Destiny, and the manifold forms of conquest that have produced the continuing and continuous carceral subjection of indigenous and aboriginal peoples via reservations, nation states, borders, notions of the frontier, and other incarcerating measures. Nor does Rodriguez's depiction of the deep historical continuities underpinning the contemporary carceral state, his pessimism of the intellect, so to speak, lead him to embrace anything like a pessimism of the will. Instead, he espouses a full-fledged commitment to an insurgent revolutionary praxis. In his words, abolition is a generative, imaginative, and productive concept precisely because it entails a radical reconfiguration of relations of power, community, collective identity, and sociality that does not rely on carcerality and its constitutive oppressive forms of state and cultural violence. Indeed, according to Rodriguez, abolitionist praxis addresses carcerality as a logic of power that generates multiple, overlapping, and differently scaled carceral regimes, reservations, plantations, segregated cities, towns, prisons, military bases, and so forth. Thus, he insists, eliminating carceral state violence via prisons, jails, police detention centers, and military bases, police detention centers and military bases is but one aspect of a broader rethinking and remaking of collective insurgent power that simultaneously asserts a liberated autonomy from and posits a radical challenge to long historical relations of gendered racial colonial dominance. As such, for Rodriguez, and in this crucial respect his account differs little from the other authors whom we have considered, abolitionism articulates a fundamental critique of existing systems of oppression while attempting to actively imagine, as it practices, forms of collective power that are liberated from hegemonic paradigms, including but not limited to forms of power constituted by the logic of carcerality, patriarchy, coloniality, racial chattel, racial capitalism, and heteronormativity. Abolitionism, and the movement for Black lives. The tension between a more reformist-friendly and a more insurgent articulation and praxis of abolitionism is rendered explicit and addressed insightfully by Brendan McQuade in his 2018 article, Histories of Abolition, Critiques of Security. In the article, McQuade analyzes a manifesto from a group associated with the movement for Black lives. The manifesto, titled Burn Down the American Plantation, sketches an insurrectionist position even more explicit than the one espoused by the academic Rodriguez, and McQuade contends it serves to expose the tension between a seemingly more moderate abolitionism based in academia and the nonprofit sector and the revolutionary iteration expressed in militant direct actions. According to McQuade, the manifesto adopts an Afro-pessimist frame and sketches 5 principles for action. 1, self-defense. 2, direct democracy down to the neighborhood level. 3, conflict resolution and revolutionary justice. 4, the abolition of gender. And 5, reorganization of social property relations along cooperative lines. In these principles, the manifesto takes inspiration from the Kurdish freedom movement's revolutionary model of democratic confederalism, a model being put into practice in the northeast of Syria in the so-called Rojava Revolution. McQuade elaborates a rather sophisticated critique of such insurgent posturing, of how the writers of the manifesto used the example of Rojava to support their call for insurrectionary action, but they never consider the wider conditions that inform the apparent success of these remarkable anti-statist experiments. Instead, McQuade insists they simply take Rojava as a blueprint and effectively assume its strategies can be applied to a radically different context without any adjustment. McQuade proceeds to sketch a Du Boisian alternative mandate for abolitionist praxis, one which highlights the interplay of disruptive direct action and incremental change within a historically informed understanding of a particular social struggle. This holistic approach, which in crucial respects resembles the Gramscian account of Gilmore, highlights the complexities that are erased by the transhistorical assertions of seemingly ubiquitous and unchanging structures of violence. McQuade is explicit in his critique of the Afro-pessimist framing of the Insurgent Manifesto. According to McQuade, the ahistorical pessimism that informs the analysis of more militant abolitionists may actually impede effective political struggle because it ignores the historical specificity of the present and therefore prevents us from developing a politics that can address the problems of our time and place. Nevertheless, McQuade, like the other authors we have considered, also espouses the ultimately revolutionary implications of abolitionism. For McQuade, abolition is the foil of bourgeois security. It is a way of thinking about producing social order outside of the logic of capital and private property, state violence, and racialized subjectivity. Indeed, McQuade argues, abolition is an important strand of revolutionary theory, one that is embedded in all liberatory movements and in the US context has a deeper historical lineage than the socialist movement. As such, McQuade contends rediscovering these global histories of abolition and recentering abolition as a counterpoint to security politics is nothing short of a necessary task in developing a viable socialist politics for the 21st century. Conclusion. Let us therefore conclude. In this lecture, we have considered a variety of scholarly accounts of abolitionist theory and praxis. We reviewed the main arguments advanced in important books by Angela Davis and Ruth Wilson Gilmore, as well as chapters and articles by Liat Ben-Moshe, Dylan Rodriguez, and Brendan McQuade. We looked at the various ways that these different accounts explain the emergence and transformations of the carceral state, as well as the emergence of the abolitionist movement in deeper histories, often emphasizing the legacy of slavery and to a lesser extent colonial settler genocide. We also examined in some detail Gilmore's conjunctural Gramscian account that situated the astronomical growth of incarceration in California in relation to the organic crisis of the military Keynesian order and the rise of neoliberalism. Finally, we highlighted both the tension between reformism and abolitionism, as well as the tension between reformist-friendly and more insurgent visions and versions of abolitionist tactics and strategy. Thank you.